It was a quiet morning in Cardiff, a mother going about her routine completely unaware that in just moments her life would be torn apart. Then she heard it. A noise outside, subtle at first but enough to make her uneasy. Then silence. She waited, listening. Was it just the wind? An animal? But something felt wrong. Then a shadow moved past the window, a breath caught in her throat. She took a step closer to the door, reached for the handle, and boom! And in the next couple of minutes, these words were heard. "Please, he's inside, he's hurting my mom." The words barely more than a whisper. A teenage girl panicked, desperate. This wasn't just a break-in. This was something far worse. A brutal home invasion leaves a mother and daughter traumatized. Released from prison just 5 days earlier, how did this happen? A crime so shocking, it forced calls for immediate reform. This is the true story of that crime. A night of horror that never should have happened. It sent shocking waves across the United Kingdom. A man who should never have been free. Joshua Carney was no stranger to the law. His criminal history stretched back years: burglary, assault, violent offenses, each arrest leading to short-lived prison terms, only for him to reoffend the moment he was released. At just 14, he was already breaking into homes. By his late teens, his crimes had escalated. Authorities knew him, victims feared him, and yet, time after time, he walked free. On February 24th, he was released from prison yet again. He was supposed to be monitored. He was supposed to be a risk. 5 days later, a mother and daughter would pay the price for that failure. The morning of March 1st began like any other. A mother up early, making coffee, checking the time. Outside, the world was still waking up. But something was off. A figure stood outside, barefoot. His clothes were torn, hanging off his frame. His face, something was wrong with his face. Blood trickled from his ears. His eyes darted, wild and unfocused. She didn't know his name, but she knew one thing. This man was dangerous. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? A man is outside, he looks wrong? Her hesitation lasted a second too long. The front door handle rattled. A hand slammed against the glass. For a brief moment, there was still hope that this was some kind of mistake, a confused stranger, someone looking for help. Then came the first impact. The door frame shook as Joshua Carney threw his weight against it. Once, twice, a third time. The lock gave way. The mother barely had time to step back before he was inside. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't looking for a way out. He had chosen this house. At first, his words were scattered. He demanded a phone. His hands twitched at his sides, his breath ragged. The mother tried to stay calm. She told him to leave, that she had nothing for him. Then, without warning, he lunged. The first blow sent her crashing against the hallway wall. She barely had time to process what was happening before he was on her again. Fists, elbows, the full force of a man who had nothing to lose. She screamed. A sound so raw it cut through the silence of the morning. Upstairs, her daughter froze. The teenager grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and ran. Her mother's cries echoed up the stairwell as she locked herself in her bedroom. Imagine how a teenager would feel hearing her mom being raped by a stranger. She quickly dialed 999, and as they asked, "What's your emergency?" a whisper, barely audible. The daughter said, "Please, he's inside. He's hurting my mum." The dispatcher's voice remained steady, but the girl's breathing quickened. If you're feeling the weight of this story, subscribe now to stay informed, to hear more untold stories, and to join the movement that seeks to protect those who cannot always protect themselves. And then something heavy crashed against the floor. A grunt, another scream, then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming up the stairs, the door handle turned. She pressed herself against the wall, phone still clutched in her hand. Then, the first hit. Wood splintered as Carney slammed against the door. The frame groaned but held. Another impact. The screws strained. The girl squeezed her eyes shut. Then, from the bottom of the stairs, her mother's voice, broken, weak. "You have to open it. Please, baby, open it." The door creaked open. She barely had time to register the sight of him before he grabbed her wrist. Bare skin, no clothes. The fight was brief, the strength of a terrified teenager against a man who had spent years in and out of prison. hardened by violence. He won. What happened next would never leave that room. The mother, forced to watch. The daughter, robbed of everything in the space of minutes. The man had his way with the girl on the bed while the mother cried and begged for mercy. The attack didn't end when he was done. It didn't end when her screams turned into silence. It ended when he decided it should, and then he punished her for calling the police. The call had already been made. Officers were on the way. But inside that house, time moved differently. Why would a man even think of raping a woman and her beloved daughter? What do you think should be done to someone like this? Minutes stretched into something unbearable. The mother and daughter, trapped in the worst moment of their lives, had no idea that help was already closing in. Then, sirens. A flash of blue lights through the window, tires screeched against pavement, doors flung open. The front door had already been broken, hanging loose from its shattered frame. Officers didn't need to force their way in. They moved quickly, weapons drawn, voices cutting through the air. The house was silent now. Carney didn't run. He stood there, hands limp at his sides, his expression blank, as if none of it had happened. He didn't resist when they grabbed him, forced him to the ground and cuffed his wrists. His first words? "I don't remember anything. I was on spice." Not an apology, not a plea for mercy, just an excuse. The mother and daughter were barely able to stand. Paramedics rushed in, checks were done, blankets were draped over shaking shoulders. The mother held onto her daughter so tightly that her fingers left marks. But no amount of medical attention could erase what had been done. Carney was led out in silence. No anger, no protest. The same way he had come in. Days later, the courtroom was packed. The press had already made their headlines. Career criminal commits heinous attack just days after release. But inside the courtroom, the focus was not on the reporters, not on the public. It was on the mother and daughter, seated just feet away from the man who had destroyed their lives. The testimonies were raw, their words broken by pauses, gasps for air. The courtroom sat in heavy silence, forced to confront the weight of what had happened inside that house. Then the judge spoke. This was the stuff of nightmares. Not just a crime, not just an attack, something worse, something that could never be undone. The verdict came down swiftly, life in prison, a minimum of 10 years. The words echoed, but did they mean anything? 10 years? For a man who had already spent half his life behind bars, who had already been given second chances, who had already proven again and again that he was a danger. Would 10 years be enough? Would it stop him from doing this again? The mother and daughter sat motionless as the sentence was read. There was no relief, no satisfaction, because no matter how many years he spent in a cell, they would carry this with them for the rest of their lives. The sentence had been handed down. The trial was over. But for the mother and daughter, nothing was truly finished. The real punishment, theirs, not his, had only just begun. Sleep was no longer an escape, it was a battlefield. "I used to be strong," the mother would later say. "Now, I can't sleep." Every shadow in the hallway, every creak of a floorboard sent her heart racing. The home that was once a sanctuary had become something else entirely, a place where nightmares didn't wait for sleep. Her daughter had changed too. "I sleep with a hammer under my pillow," she admitted, a desperate attempt to feel in control. To believe, even for a second, that she wouldn't be powerless again. The invisible scars ran deeper than the ones that could be seen. Neither of them could step outside without scanning their surroundings. A man passing too closely on the street? A potential threat. A knock at the door? A reason to freeze. What had been stolen from them wasn't just their safety. It was their ability to trust, especially men. It wasn't a conscious choice, it was survival, a defense mechanism built from terror. And no prison sentence would ever give them back what they lost. But the question remained, why had this ever been allowed to happen? Why was Joshua Carney, a man with a record of violence, a man who had spent years proving he could not live among others, ever given the chance to destroy another life? The system had seen him before. Again and again, a boy who became a criminal before he could even drive, a teenager whose name became familiar in police stations, in courtrooms, in prison records, a man who had walked in and out of prison as if it were nothing more than a revolving door. He was not an unknown danger. The warnings had been there. His past had written them in bold letters. Burglary, assault, violent outbursts, and yet 5 days after being released, he stood barefoot and bleeding outside a stranger's home, free to do what he did next. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of a system designed to protect the public but often prioritizing rehabilitation over reality. Early release policies, meant to give offenders a second chance, had given a predator another opportunity. But at what cost? This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, this was a pattern, a loophole being used. Men like Carney weren't interested in second chances. They weren't searching for redemption. They were waiting for the doors to open, waiting for the next victim, and the system kept giving them the opportunity. But how often does something like this really happen, stranger attacks, especially ones as brutal as this? Most violent crimes involve people who know each other, a dispute, a grudge, a situation that escalates. But when a stranger forces their way in, when they turn a random home into a hunting ground, the fear spreads far beyond just those directly affected. Because if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. This was not a targeted attack. It wasn't premeditated. It was pure opportunity. And that is what makes it terrifying. Experts in criminal psychology have studied men like Carney. They look for patterns, warning signs, ways to prevent repeat offenses. But there's one reality that cannot be ignored. Some offenders don't stop. Some never change. Recidivism, the tendency for criminals to reoffend, is disturbingly high for violent offenders. Some call it addiction, others a deeply rooted compulsion. Whatever the term, the outcome remains the same. If given the chance, they will do it again. The justice system relies on reform, on the belief that punishment leads to change. But when the crime is this brutal, when the risk is this high, is it worth the gamble? How many more victims will it take before the system asks itself the one question that matters most? Are we keeping the public safe, or are we just giving criminals another opportunity to prove they never should have been free? Carney was sentenced 10 years, a minimum. But for the mother and daughter, the sentence is for life. Every night they struggle to sleep. Every stranger on the street is a reminder. Every locked door is both a comfort and a reminder of why it has to be locked in the first place. Justice, in its legal form, was served, but justice doesn't erase the scars. Justice doesn't bring back who they were before. The damage is done. And now the question remains, will we let it happen again? Or will we finally start protecting the innocent before another monster gets the chance to strike? If you felt the weight of this story, subscribe now to stay informed, to hear more untold stories, and to join the movement that seeks to protect those who cannot always protect themselves.